All right, g'day everyone. Thank you all for coming along. I think we've got the good to go to start now because the recording started and I've got permission from the powers that be. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming along to tonight or today's presentation from everywhere around the world. My name is Rob, coming to you from Australia today. Thanks to Lucia and the Euros Corps for inviting me to do this. We're going to talk today about how to do a debate when you know nothing about the topic, which will hopefully be useful going into Euros just in case. So I have a PowerPoint slide I'll share in a second. If anyone has any questions along the way, chuck them in the Zoom chat, but there'll also be a section for questions and answers at the end of the seminar as well. So plenty of opportunities to get involved. Let me share my screen now and we'll get this underway. All right. So I'll just make sure I can see everything I need to be seeing. Oh, wrong button. Anyway. All right. So I think the first thing to say about, wrong way again, about doing a debate you know nothing about is unfortunately that you do need to know some things about the world, which I guess is a bit of a false advertisement of the session. But it is useful to have a broader view of the kind of things that are happening in the world, because the debates you know the least about are generally ones where it's based on like a current affair issue or something in the news you might not have read out about. So I think that it's quite useful to just subscribe to a bunch of international news sites on your Facebook or your other social media feeds, so you're passively engaging the content then. I think YouTube also commonly has a couple of great explainer videos on different conflicts. So if you just type war conflicts or economic theories or whatever you're not sure about, so if you just type in the thing and then explainer or something into YouTube, you should find a lot of answers. Obviously try and watch a couple, because I imagine some of them will have particular ideological slants in them. And I think also watching old debates on YouTube or watching out rounds at tournaments is particularly important as a way to sort of understand how debates work, get used to sort of the common arguments that are run. And even if you'll see arguments you'll never think of running, but you can sort of like drop them down in the back of your mind and you'll come to a similar debate and be like, yep, I can run that argument. I've seen that run by so-and-so at this tournament or this out round that I watched back in the day. So I think those are all sort of like some broad starting tips I would suggest, but we're going to get a bit more detailed in today's seminar. So we're going to look at a couple of, I think, the common sort of areas and look at, like, I guess, basic first principles or basic ideas that you can use to build a case off, even if you don't know the specifics of the topic. And that will at least get you started in the debate. I think the biggest thing to take away is that the main objective is just to get up and have a go. And even if you don't do very well or your extension is derivative or whatever, the main thing is that you're getting up there and giving a speech, and that's the most important part of it. And if you've probably already gathered, a lot of this will be targeted, I guess, at newer debaters, but hopefully there's still something in here to learn for everyone. So building a case from bare facts. I think you only need to know one or two really basic things, and that will help build out the case from there, based on like the logicking it out or thinking about it or just reading what the debate has to say. So I want to start, I think, with an example of how this could work. So this is a topic that I debated in at Athens Open a couple of years ago, that we regret, or this house would regret, the Palestinian rejection of the US peace summit in Bahrain. And my teammate Uday and I went to that debate. We were and we were like, there was a peace summit in Bahrain. And so we had no idea what we were doing. We ended up walking out with the second. Our CO took the first. That was Assam from Israel. So he kind of had a bit more expert knowledge. But even though we knew nothing about the topic specifically, there are a couple of basic facts we could pull from that were enabled us to make a case. And I think this sort of illustrates the type of thing I'm going to talk about during the rest of the seminar. If this was in person, it's a bit more interactive, but I think it's easier online if I just talk about it. So when we look at this topic, we can see that it involves Palestine and peace. So it's probably about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Also, the USA is involved, and the fact the peace conference is in Bahrain is probably not the most important fact, or not a fact we could really know anything about without knowing about the topic. So even from that alone, we have the foundations of a case of what we could talk about with that. So what do we know? We know Palestine-Israel conflict. We know the USA is allied with Palestine. So what does that give us the capacity to intuit? It probably lets us intuit a couple of things, that if the USA is organizing it, it's probably not likely to be the most pro-Palestinian thing in the world because of the USA's relationship with Israel. What is the thing that Palestine, we're going to say, most wants? Some degree of statehood or peace or control over its lands. Unlikely to be given up in any sort of peace conference. So maybe, this house regret. So maybe the going to the peace conference is probably then likely to be not going to achieve exactly what Palestine wants. but being at the table is better than not being at the table at all. So it actually just became a debate then about whether or not it is better to be a part of the process and engage in these things as a meaningful actor to show good faith, or to try and increase the situation, or just not engage at all. And even from that, we knew nothing about the peace conference or the economic summit, but we were still able to start to build a case from those basic facts, which we just kind of gone through there. So from the government case, they're not going to talk about things we want. So we don't want to be involved in that, sends a strong message. If we're op, we're doing the opposite of that, about being at the table. And that enabled us to pretty much get into the debate without even knowing about it. Again, similar quote one here about this House believes that Malaysia should abandon its system of privileges for the Bumiputra. Unfortunately, we got that debate very wrong, but we still got in case of speeches. So I think this is an example of, like, no matter how good you are, it is okay sometimes stuff up, because we thought that the affirmative action was in place for a group that probably wasn't very powerful, which is quite a logical assumption to make, right? If a system of privileges exists for this group, it's probably because they're disadvantaged and they're getting a booster. So we ran a case about why it is good that disadvantaged groups get a boost. Unfortunately, that wasn't the reality, and the Bumiputra were the already overly empowered group. So we made a mistake. We got the fourth. You move on. But the main thing was we had to get up and give a case. So how do we start building off that? Now we've got some examples of the sort of things we're talking about in our mind. I think the first thing you look at is, funnily enough, first principles. So for a more detailed look, I think you should look up the Tim Sonnereich guides from Monash. They have a great set of information about first principles and how to run debates off that. So what they are is they're general ideas about debating, or general-based arguments that they're applicable to almost all debates in a certain area. So they can't work across multiple different types of or topic areas, but within that topic area, they're useful for almost all the debates. And obviously, you get better at them the more you do them, and the more things you know, your debates will improve. But it's an excellent jumping on point for, I guess, starting the direction of your case. So if you're able to, in the prep leading up to a major or to a tournament, sort of get a handle on what are the basic first principles of a few different topic areas, so we have a starting point for how to think about cases if we don't know what they are. So let's start with, I think, the most common one, and that is the role of the government, freedom of choice, consent, that broad area of topic areas. So that's particularly useful in debates when you're talking about banning something or restricting access to something. So what that question is, if you know nothing about the specific example in the debate, it's just a question about whether or not the government should be big or small. So by big government, we mean things like the government making lots of legislation, lots of policy that is quite interventionist. So it involves itself a lot in the market. It attempts to correct for a lot of issues that exist in the marketplace, versus a small government is kind of let the market be free, let consumers and businesses sort everything out. So an example of quite a big government would be quite I guess in some respects, quite a left-wing government. I think maybe Australia is a bit of an example of that at times, where they heavily regulate lots of things. And I guess at its most extreme, it's regimes. But a small government is one that sort of has as little involvement as possible. So as less legislation as possible, which is kind of on one of its most extremes, what Trump was going for in his term of government. So if you're asking a debate about banning something, it's a simple question of when should the government step into people's lives? So you've got an example here that we should abolish sin taxes. And I'll apologize now, I've just remembered that all the topics in this slides are written as if they're Austral's topics. So they're all that we should, as opposed to this House would, but they're the same topic. So in that debate, a sin tax is just a tax on things that we consider sinful. So smoking or alcohol or fatty foods. So the question there is it right for the government to step in here and start fiddling with the market to determine what people should or should not eat or drink? So should the government be making assessments about what it is okay for people to do, so long as they're not harming someone else? So in this case, you could probably make a pretty solid claim that if you don't smoke in someone's face, you're not really particularly harming them. If you don't force someone else to eat junk food, you're not particularly harming them by doing those actions. So why ought the government step in and regulate your behavior? And even if you don't know anything about the sin taxes, you can still make an argument that says people should be free to live the lives that they want to live. And you can sort of put in as little information as you need about sin taxes to make it work. And then and that also applies to lots of other debates too. There was a debate about the government sort of regulating acts of BDSM or things like that. So will be a more controversial example, because there is potentially harm to the other person, but ought the government have the right to step into the bedrooms of its citizens and tell them what two consenting adults can and cannot do? And then, even without knowing too much about BDSM in that example, you could run a pretty reasonable principle about how that would operate. And once you sort of set up, like, can the government do this or not do this? It then becomes a question about whether or not this is the right way to do it. So if we use the sin tax example again, maybe making junk food like twice as expensive is not a very good idea, because lots of people enjoy a kebab after a big night out, and they shouldn't be financially punished for doing that. Perhaps an education campaign or some sort of healthcare campaign or something, better education in schools is a better way to achieve the same aim without the government being too involved. So already you've got two arguments there you can base your case off. And if you're closing, if your opening misses one of them, you've got an entire half the debate to run. If your opening runs both of them, you've got capacity to sort of like pick the one they ran worst and try again, running it even better than they did. So I think that's the first kind of broad area I want to talk about. Actually, there's more on this, sorry. So when you're talking about freedom of choice, and whether or not a person can consent to the sort of dangers that exist, even if you don't know too much about the topic, you should already know that for any sort of consent argument, there are broadly 4 things I need to prove. So you can start from that starting point without having to spend too much time in prep thinking of them. So I guess the 4 general things you're looking for in a consent argument are things like knowledge, do you know what thing is you're doing, what the potential consequences are and risks are, and all that sort of thing. Secondly, do you have the capacity to understand that? So that's things like under 18-year-olds, we don't think have the capacity to understand the consequences of drinking, so we don't let them drink, or under 16s can't drive. Are they free from any external degree of influence? And that's obviously on a scale. So there's obviously some degree of influence in every decision we make, like parents trying to pressure children into a certain career or into going to university or what university to go to. Those things we might not consider to be influences that override our capacity to consent, but maybe just influence it. But again, there's a clash there. And then the last one being things like alternatives. So can you say no? Could you do something like third option instead of the choice that is being presented to you? So that I think is a good starting point to keep in mind whenever you've got a sort of debate about freedom that involves some kind of choice, some kind of ban, and you don't know what to run. So if we have an example topic here again, technology that exists allows individuals to permanently erase parts of their own memory, that we should allow the use of technology then. So I think the affirmative team would likely sort of, the government team could quite easily run a consent principle if they know nothing else, that we should let this technology happen. Individuals have a right to choose what they want to choose to do with their mind, it's their body, and they can fully consent to this choice. And the negative team then, we're just doing austral season here in Australia, so all the terms are around the wrong way. The opposition benches might say, well, actually, that's incorrect because we don't fully understand the consequences of removing a memory to your long-term capacity, to your impact on your personality and things like that. So you can't actually fully consent in those circumstances. And similar things like this, I think, would exist for like legalizing all drugs, or allowing people to like pursue things that make them most happy and things like that without government involvement. So it's quite an applicable principle you can use in lots of things. So we've got a question here that I'll try and answer while we're on the topic. So I might just need a bit more clarity on that question. I don't quite understand it, but I will come back to it. So if you can just sort of explain it again to me, I will get back to that question. So that kind of fills up the first one. I want to now look at the criminal justice system, another really particularly common area. So again, some criminal justice debates can be complicated. I think a lot of people are all like, I think there's a bit of a stigma like there's too many law debates and it only benefits lawyers. But I think there's actually very few debates that are actually super beneficial to lawyers or to law students, because very few debates actually engage with really super specific aspects of law or in ways you are taught law at university. And to the extent those do occur, I don't think they occur any more than, or any significantly degree more than most other subject areas. But if you're going into a criminal justice debate, there's broadly going to be 4 things that every criminal justice debate is going to want to talk about. So if you know what those 4 things are, you can kind of see which one fits into the debate most and what side of the motion we're on for that, and then run the idea. So I guess there's 4 main things in a criminal justice debate. There's retribution, that is punishing the perpetrator for their actions. And what you're doing in a retribution sort of position is saying the victim is the most important. So we would prioritize the victim's rights in the criminal justice system. and you can then talk all about why victims are the most important. That's a whole argument that takes up 2 or 3 minutes of your speech. Then you talk about how whatever it is in the motion helps victims, another 2 or 3 minutes of your speech, take a POI, your speech is done without having known much about it. Protection, and this one is about, we lock people away, we put restrictions on their liberty to protect broader members of the community from any potential ongoing harm, and that's all about focus on the broader community. So that might be why we lock up dangerous criminals, or we put exclusion notices around like child sex offenders so they can't go near schools, etc., in order to protect the community. The third one is rehabilitation, and that is about sort of helping offenders once they've offended to not offend again. So that is looking specifically at the offender. So saying the most important part of the criminal justice system is to help the person who commits the crimes to not commit them again. And then deterrence, pretty straightforward, stop other people from doing it. And that's kind of focused on everyone to an extent. What I think you'd notice with all of these is that they are kind of overlapping at times, and some do support other ones. So obviously, if a criminal is particularly rehabilitated, that does help the community a fair bit because the community is more likely to be protected going forward. Similarly, deterrence helps the community as well if the people aren't committing future crimes or anyone's committing a crime. So if we had a motion, this House, with the consent of victims, those found guilty of crimes should be able to pay compensation to the victim instead of going to jail. So basically, you can pay your way out of jail if the victim says yes. So if we're gov on that and we're not quite sure what the hell to do with this motion, we look at who's in the motion. So we've got, it's basically those found guilty being able to get out of going to jail. That probably suggests we're more focused on the offender and their capacity to rehabilitate if we think jail is bad. So we're probably going to take a more rehabilitative-based approach. So our case should then be geared around explaining what rehabilitation is, why it's particularly important, and why not being in jail is useful for it. And that, I think, gives us a great starting point, even if we look at that topic and have no idea what to do. The other person in this topic is victims, and it's about their consent. So probably, to some extent, we do care about victims because the retributive goal is also met. Notice at this point, we haven't really talked about deterrence, and we haven't really talked about protection. So there are times when you would prioritize certain elements of those clashes, of those elements. So in this case, we'd be prioritizing probably rehabilitation and to some extent the victim, maybe sacrificing some degree of protection or some degree of deterrence. Those things are probably still up for debate. I think you can make very reasonable claims on Gov as to why you achieve both those things. But if the op makes even better claims around that, you at least have a standing point here on why you think this is the most important. So if we're on, again, so if we were to flip that and say we're on op for this motion, we're like, this is particularly bad because it's really giving offenders a way out here. So it doesn't focus on a lot of retribution, which probably hurts the victims to some extent because they might have short-term desires to get money that then means they can't actually get the full justice they want, or it might actually hurt protection, or it might hurt deterrence, because if rich people can just pay money and get out of jail, then that's probably pretty bad for deterring rich people from committing crimes. So you're able to sort of flip the prioritization around. So hopefully you can sort of see here how having these four things in your back pocket will help you sort of start your case rolling, even if you've got no idea what to say in a topic. Let's change again now to democracy. And these are debates, I think, about anything to do with democracy. Sometimes they often engage with politics debates as well, or anything around how government systems or structures should work. So in most democracy debates, there'll be three broad elements that teams are going to try and want to talk about. That being accountability, representation, and participation. And often these three things are then weighed up against outcomes. So in terms of accountability and what that means, accountability means that people who make decisions are basically can be held accountable or face repercussions or outcomes for their decisions. And obviously the most reasonable way to do that in functioning democracies is by the freedom of the press, and then most meaningfully by the capacity to vote them in or out at the next election. So any sort of change to how political parties run, or any sort of change to how the democratic system runs, would want to ensure that people can be held accountable for their decisions. So if we had a debate about suspending elections during the time of COVID, accountability is probably somewhat up in the air there, because on the one hand, you get eventual accountability of an election after COVID. But if that election is 4 years later than it should be because of COVID, that probably is does in some way impact accountability and maybe is not something we ought to do. The second one is representation. This one's pretty straightforward. You want people to have their voices heard in Parliament and in government. And that's exactly why we elect people in democracies to represent people. So if a motion sort of tries to increase the capacity of people to be represented, that is probably a good thing. But there's obviously limits on that because we sort of functionally can't operate in a system where every single person votes on every single piece of legislation, which comes into the outcomes bit. So I'll touch on more of that in a second. And the third one is participation. So for a healthy democracy, you kind of want everyone to be participating, to be politically active and aware and involved and making informed choices at the ballot box. So obviously, the most participative democracies, I guess, in a technical sense, are places like Australia that have compulsory voting for everyone over 18. You could argue whether or not that is meaningful, if they're just, donkey voting. Or is quite a common Australian pastime, like destroying a penis on your ballot and putting that in instead of voting for anyone. But maybe because of compulsory voting, people are more likely to be more involved and like listen to political advertising or read up on the parties to be a part of it. And you want people to be participating, right? Because that is how you make sure the government is actually doing things that people want, rather than just the minority who are politically active getting what they want from the government. So most debates around that will try and maximize any of these three, or if there's a trade-off, you will be, again, trying to prioritize which one of those is most useful. And all of those in general then have to be weighed up again against the outcomes. So this is what I was hinting at earlier. So I guess the starting point for this idea is a democracy as a system of government is kind of only there as the system, and is only a system, only has a value insofar as it produces good outcomes for people. So if a democracy exists but consistently produces awful outcomes, maybe it is not a good system in and of itself. So for example, if we were talking about representation being the most important thing, we couldn't have a political system where every single person is a member of parliament, the smallest minorities, individual, every man is an island kind of stuff, because we just never get anything passed, even though that would increase representation and would increase participation, because it doesn't actually then achieve the outcomes of democracy. So there's always that counterbalance in debate. So if you're in a debate and you think, or you see one team going super hard on one of these elements, but then you're able to be like, well, hang on, they haven't done that properly. So now I'm going to talk about why outcomes means that we're okay to sacrifice some maximization of the other side's benefits. So if we look at the topic here as an example, this House would abolish all political parties and instead force people to run as independents. That is probably quite good, because there's a lot of things you can say that are bad about political parties in terms of how, it's usually two parties, you don't really get a meaningful choice, there's lots of corruption, etc. They often elect bad candidates, a bunch of reasons why they're bad. But trying to practically put together a system where you have, 300 something senators and House Representative members in the US trying to structurally make a government is probably going to be pretty bad in that case. So even though a government team in that, or a prop team, might have some great reasons how this increases all these benefits, it doesn't actually produce a good democratic outcome. So therefore, we would not support that kind of system. I think things like, lowering the voting age probably also applies to all of these sort of benefits too, or a motion about suspending elections probably would engage in this as well. And I guess the suspending elections point is probably also difficult, because couldn't really have an election during a Delta variant outbreak of COVID because everyone would die. So that would probably be a bad outcome, even if it does increase accountability. Hopefully that's not a Euros motion upcoming that I've just sort of, had to go at during a public forum, but we'll see. I next want to talk about feminism. And how to approach feminism debates. Because I think sometimes, I think feminism should be you should treat it like any other sort of matter prepping. You should be reading up on it and understanding it. But sometimes the concepts of the debates in feminism can seem a bit difficult to enter into. But I think to make a broad sort of assertion about how feminism debates work, they're broadly about whether feminism ought to be narrow or ought to be broad, and particularly about how women's choices should operate within that. So when I say broad church, I'm talking about lots of views and lots of disagreements, things like pro-life and pro-choice feminists, all being allowed in being able to claim the movement, to claim the title of feminist, and all being part of the feminist movement. and about maximizing choices, whatever the consequences are, because it's all about maximizing, I guess, choice and autonomy for women. Conversely, a narrow approach to feminism is one that's sort of far more cohesive. It has sort of one vision. It limits choices based on what it perceives is in the best interests of the movement, and it kind of tries to exclude other groups. So like a strictly pro-choice group would exist in a narrow view. And I think at its most extreme, things like TERFs would fit into the narrow view of feminism. That is not a commentary on saying they're good or anything. I think there are bad examples on both sides of broad and narrow approaches to feminism. And those things can also differ from issue to issue. So a feminist movement might be particularly broad on one thing, but particularly narrow on another thing. So if we were to try and apply this to a couple of topics, if we sort of had the idea that the feminist movement should actively include male members, and you're stuck, you've got no idea why the feminist movement would want to do this, what it's trying to do there, if you break it down, is just make the feminist movement bigger. It's just trying to say we ought to have more people in there and be a broader group of feminism. So if we figured out that we're on the side that's like broad feminism good, we can automatically think of some basic sort of arguments there. We've got more people, that means our message gets out there more. More people means more people likely care about our issues or vote for them, or we're able to raise more awareness, or we look good when we're promoting things. But on the other side, if you're in opposition, you read that motion like, so we've got to be the narrow. We've got to say, no, we don't want male leaders in feminism. So we're taking a smaller approach. And that could be because even if we have less people in this movement, then we are okay with that because the movement is like still stronger as a consequence. Because maybe you lose more women if you have male leaders. Maybe there's a diversity of opinions in the group now that is harmful for the feminist movement, as like woke male leaders try and like change the movement in ways that are beneficial to them. So if you have no idea how to structure your case, you can figure out which side you're on and then start building your case in a more generic sense around why more or less people is good. The next one here, the feminist movement should support artificial wombs. This one, I think, deals more with the concept of choice and whether or not maximizing the choices of women is particularly useful. This was a debate set at ABP, the Asian British Parliamentary Championships, a couple of years ago. Because kind of from the gov there, you're like, all right, we're supporting artificial wombs. That's probably enabling choice for women. So we're just going to talk about why the feminist movement ought maximize the freedom of choices of women, that women know what, individual women know what is best for them and ought make the choices that suit them. From op, you know that you are now basically saying you should not support something. So you're saying that the feminist movement should tell women not to do something. Why would a feminist movement ever tell a woman not to do something? Probably because it overall harms women on net. So you might want to structure your case around then why it is okay to reduce this choice because it only applies to a certain group of people in a way that is harmful to everyone else. So you start to have a case direction there for your case about why the feminist movement should be interventionist. And you can kind of hopefully see from those examples that this kind of also looks like the banning debates stuff that we were talking about when the government ought and ought not intervene in the market. It's the same sort of thing here, but just a different body intervening in a different place. So again, having a grasp of these basic concepts will help you apply similar argumentation to very different topic areas as you go along in debating. The third example we've got here, this House as feminists would not criticize women regardless of their political beliefs. So basically we would never criticize as feminists Maggie Thatcher or Julia Gillard or Hillary Clinton or Jacinda Ardern. So in those sort of cases, it's a similar sort of question here too about broad versus narrow feminism. So if a woman has like objectively achieved feminist goals of like being a position of power, or the feminist movement sort of like not criticize them because that is like good for women overall to have female leaders and good for engaging women of certain political beliefs in the movement if they can see them as heroes? Or is that bad then if those people have like objectively bad political decisions, like destroying labor movements and crushing the hopes and dreams of most of England to pursue their own ideologically evil actions? I'm obviously not biased at all around my thoughts on Maggie Thatcher. But again, basic sort of, if you've got no idea about what feminism should do here, you can see what the approach is trying to take and build a case based around that. And the last case we've got here is that as the feminist movement, companies should, we should support sorry, that topic's not worded properly. That should say that we as a feminist movement should support companies offering egg freezing programs to female employees, same as the artificial womb stuff, maximizing choice versus that choice is harmful for lots of women, therefore we ought not support it. And I think that gives you a good starting point to build a case from. So that then kind of makes it easy to put your feminism debates into clashes. So what is the goal of feminism? What should it look like? Do these policies actually advance the rights of those women, characterizing the scale of them, key stakeholders, and what your impact is on the movement? And I think there is actually a section of movement debates coming up as well. So we can talk about that there too. But again, if you knew nothing about egg freezing technologies or artificial wombs, doesn't matter, because it's actually just a debate about whether or not the feminist movement should maximize or support limiting the choices of women in the world. Which we've actually got now on movement debates. So whatever the movement, things like Black Lives Matter, feminism, the trans movement, the workers' movement, etc., you can derive really what their basic kind of goals are without knowing too much about those movements. So obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement is about improving racial equality and stopping the murder of African Americans on the street. At its most basic level, there's obviously a lot more to it than that, but even if you know nothing about it, you can kind of figure out those are its basic goals. So once you can derive what those basic goals are, there's probably three basic goals that exist across all types of movements, which is actually where this slide was meant to be going. I put some of these things hidden in the slide so as not to give away the answer straight away. And then I forgot that the answers were there, so we went on a different train. But whatever the movement, there are some basic goals of any sort of social movement that exists. So obviously a movement wants to get members. And that could be a question of retaining existing members or gaining new members. And what type of new members do they want? Movements also generally want policy change. So, BLM wants policy changes around the police. Workers want policy changes around employment laws. And you obviously want media attention. Maybe all publicity is good publicity doesn't always apply as a theory, but you do want media attention as a group so that you can start to, grow your message. So if you have debate about a social movement and what they should do, and you know nothing about the social movement, think about whether or not the action in the debate is going to do any of these three things, and then you talk about how that thing achieves any of these three goals. So if we had a debate about similar to we looked at that feminism one again from a minute ago about actively including male leaders, for example, does that gain new members? Probably, because it you're reaching out to men now. Men are likely to get involved because they see a male leader and they're like, oh, he's a man, he says feminism is good, I'll follow him. But are you also likely to lose existing members who think that the feminist space should be one that is free for women? Or to use another example from Australs a couple of years ago that was reused recently about whether the Black Lives Matter movement should align itself with Southern Baptist churches. Maybe there's a big group of members there you could gain by doing this, by basing yourself in alignment with a religious faith, but you might also lose some members of that movement because the Black Lives Matter movement extends beyond just a certain religious grouping of those members. And then I guess sort of flowing on from that, it's whether or not that actually then helps you achieve your policy change. So we've had a movement about women of color separating from the feminist movement. Does that help or hurt the capacity to advocate for policy change? You could argue from one side that obviously if a smaller group is part of a bigger group, those ideas are likely to be suppressed, so they don't get their issues specifically at the top of the discussion ladder, so never get policy change. But they're on their own, then their issues are at the top, but just breaking the movement apart reduce the capital of either group to promote themselves. I think that also applies to media attention as well. So when you get a debate about any sort of movement and what they should do, think about what the goals of a broad goals of movement are. Can I figure out how this topic helps those groups achieve that? And then in terms of international relations debates, this is quite a classic debate here, and I love using this because I've used this structure to in debating invade 7 different countries to varying levels of success. There are a bunch of common types of debates with regards to international relations. There's things like intervention debates, so whether or not we should invade militarily or sanctioned countries. There's things about aid, like should aid be conditional? Is it effective? or things like how best to engage with foreign leaders. So like, should we, act all tough, or should we try and bring them to the table to discuss things? Things like, I think North Korea is a good example of that last one, where we've seen two different types of strategies employed of like, sanctioning, cutting them off from discussions. And we've also seen things like meeting with North Korea as Trump did, or as was done at the Winter Olympics a couple of years ago, where the leaders of the two Koreas met together. So if we're talking about international intervention debates, anytime you're doing a debate intervention, there's going to be three questions that you should be answering. So if a debate's asking you to invade somewhere, the first question you should be asking is, should we actually do it? Obviously, if you're Gov, you should be invading somewhere. Obviously, if you're Op, you ought not be invading that place for the debate to work. But presumably there's some sort of reason why the debate's being set. So that should give you some sort of hope as affirmative to answer the first question of like, should we actually get involved here? So the most common one that's been floating around is places like Venezuela in the last year, given what happened with Guaido and the elections and the subsequent protests and military action. So from that, you can generate a pretty significant imperative that there is bad shit happening, and we ought to stop that bad shit happening. The second question is then, can we do it? So would we be successful in achieving this? So probably the whole might of the US or global military raining down upon Venezuela might indeed successfully intervene in Venezuela and stop the military violence. But if you look to an older example of like intervening in Crimea when Russia was involved there, maybe the whole might of the world invading there would not simply liberate Crimea. Maybe that'd be more complicated. Which leads, I guess, to the third question then of like, what are the long-term impacts of doing this? So if we're successful in the short term, like if we can, put a banner up on our naval warship and say mission accomplished in 2 weeks, are we pulling out 20 years later, having completely lost the war and actually made things worse? I'll leave you to figure out what I'm referencing there. So anytime you're doing intervention debate, think about those three questions. And those work for all three sides. So both Gov and Op could look at these three questions and have very different opinions on whether or not they operate. And exactly right, the latest question that's come through, it definitely would apply, it definitely would intervene with things like talk about fanaticism there in Iraq and Syria. That would absolutely be a way in which the second sort of questions of like, can we do it and what are the long-term impacts? Those would absolutely be relevant to things like how fanatical are local groups are going to respond to this. Is it going to make the situation a lot worse? So if we can't successfully intervene militarily, because we'll just lose to guerrilla fighters and things like that. So maybe you want to be looking then to the other side of the instead of intervening, do we do something softer? Do we do things like economic sanctions? Do we aid local fighters? Or do we say, yeah, this situation is very, very bad. We concede the first issue that something should be done, but we will prove that doing something makes things worse than they are now. Because like the burden on an op team is not necessarily to fix every problem, but just to prove that the government makes the status quo worse than what it currently is. So think about those three things. And yes, so to jump from a very heavy topic to a quite important and serious and fun topic, that being sports debates. Now I love sports debates, and I know lots of people don't like them, but I think the thing to think about sports debates is very, very few sports debates outside of like sports IVs are actually about sports. So a debate about whether or not Japan should have gone for a scrum penalty, should have gone for a try or taken the 3 points in the semi-final of the World Cup a couple of years ago is an entirely sports debate. And that one, if you don't know about rugby, then you are kind of like, you're a goner. But that's unlikely to be said at any tournament except for sports IV. So what sports debates are actually likely to be about are about economics, or they're about movements in sorts of similar ways. So in the same way, a movement debate, you can sort of say most general movements care about membership, they care about media attention, and they care about policy change. What is a sports team if not a movement of people? A sports team needs members. It needs members so it can have money. A sports team needs media attention so that it can gain money from sponsorship. And I guess maybe it doesn't care as much about policy change, but it does care about the league being successful, for example. So what do sports teams care about? They care about money. So things exactly like a corporation does. So how in an economics debate would a corporation respond to a change in the world? By doing things that maximize its capacity to make income. it cares about fans, and it cares about success, because sports teams want to win things. And who else is important in sports debates? It's fans. Fans are basically customers for a business, or they are potential members for a social movement. So what do they care about? They care about success. Now, sometimes you'll hear in debates, people say things like, sports fans don't actually want their team to win all the time because it'd be really boring if their team wins all the time. They want competition. That person has never actually seen a sports match or cares about sport or follows a team. Because I can tell you, every sports team wants to win all the time, and it never gets boring watching your sports team win all the time. As someone whose team, the Rabbitohs, went 43 years without winning a premiership, and I spent most of my time at school being bullied because my team finished last on the ladder. It has never gotten old to watch us win a match in the last couple of years. So fans probably care about success, but there's also a question about pure entertainment or pure athleticism as a value for sporting fans. So things like enabling performance-enhancing drugs in sport, a topic debate I did actually this morning. You want to question there, like, if we allow performance-enhancing drugs, does sport just become more and more exciting because people are now better at the activity, or does it ruin the value of sport because it's not testing pure athleticism now? Some might argue the Tour de France as a sporting example of excellence has been ruined by the fact that everyone who wins it is allegedly taking drugs. So if we look at an example topic here about this House believes that new sporting leagues entering new countries should focus on developing the national team before developing local club leagues. So you don't actually need to know anything about sport to do this motion. Obviously, if you do, you might do a bit better. But basically, it's just like, so we're a new thing entering a new market. Where are we likely to gain more support from engaging local communities or engaging more nationally? And what does a sports team need to be successful, or a sports league? It needs money and it needs members. So you can start to sort of approach, all right, how am I going to think about this? We need to make more money. Do we make money by having a local team in Campbelltown, where I'm from here, and a local team in Toowoomba, and a local team in South Perth, for example? Sorry about all the Australian examples. Or do we have a team that is just all about Australia and we try and win gold medals in the Olympics? What is likely to get us more money? And you can start to sort of intuit and have a go, then it's sort of bringing up ways to suggest how you'll get there, even without knowing anything about that specific sports league. So if European handball, for example, were to start launching in Australia, I love European handball, and it really annoys me if I only watch it during the Olympics. What would get it more success? Probably going to the Olympics first would likely get us more media attention, but will that get us players? Or do we need to start trying to advertise ourselves locally first in order to then get a team together to make the National League? Things like that are starting points to think about with sports debates. So don't be scared of sports debates; they're fun. And I think Andy Hume said this once. Like, we expect people to know the full intricacies of like economic policy and international relations debates. But you ask any cabbie in London their opinions on the EPL, and they'll be able to give you like an hour-long lecture. So it probably is very reasonable that debaters talk about sports. So what we've sort of gone through so far is kind of like a bunch of different ideas inside individual topic areas as starting points. So hopefully what you'll be able to do from this point is sort of go into one of those broad topic areas and think like, all right, I've got no idea what this topic's about, but I know it's a movement debate, and I know I want to get more members, or I know it's a criminal justice debate, and I've figured out that we're pro-victims. How do I build my case from there? So it's a good starting point. What I want to talk about now is a couple of non-topic area specific tools that can help you kind of guide what the structure or approach of your case will be, that I think kind of like are a few shortcuts to help you at least get a starting point on how to build your case. So the best one here, and this like changed my life when I learned about this, was hard versus soft models. And this is particularly important, I guess, in opening half debates, but also relevant to closing half debates. So modeling exists upon a spectrum from very hard to very soft. So a very, very hard model is one that is almost certainly likely to achieve its harms, to achieve success, but with that comes more harms. So a hardline model in an intervention, in like a criminal justice debate of like, you know, banning, let's use a hyperbolic example for a bit of fun to start with. If we had the motion, this House would ban school uniforms. A very hardline model there would be to summarily execute any student who wears a uniform to school. that would 100% stop every child wearing a school uniform to school. But it probably has, maybe a few moral concerns about summarily executing children for the clothes they wear. So if you are on a topic and you go hardline, your case structure then needs to change, because your case structure needs to be about why the harms of the status quo are so bad that the harms of the model are worth it for the success you'll gain. So to use a less hyperbolic example, if you want to invade a country to stop something happening, you have to prove that the harms that are occurring at the moment are so bad that it's worth copying the harms of an invasion. So if we were to talk about invading Venezuela, we'd have to talk about the conditions at the moment with the conflict going on are so bad that it is worth the engaging. So that's the strategy you need to approach then, because that will inform how you come up with the rest of your arguments. If you're from the opposition, then you know immediately when you see that motion's gone hardline that your case needs to be the opposite of that. Your case needs to be that the harms of that model are so much worse than the status quo would be. So it gives you a strong direction of case you can run. Obviously, you might have to prop like two different case directions depending on what the government does, but it gives you a strong direction of what you need to do. The opposite of that is a soft model. And a soft model means you get less harms, but you're also likely to have less success. So if we use the example of school uniforms again and banning school uniforms, you have a really soft line model where you send a note to parents and you ask them not to have their child wear a uniform. There's literally zero harms to doing that. Maybe there's a harm of like printing paper, but you can just email it. But you're unlikely to see a lot of change then in that. To use a more realistic example, if you were like, we should intervene in Venezuela, a very soft line model would be to send a letter to the person acting as president and be like, hey, can you please stop? This is really bad. Again, no harms to doing that, but are you going to achieve any success? Probably not. So if you're the government, you want to sort of be prepared then to defend the efficacy of your policy immediately. So you want to be able to get up there and right away say that even though we've gone a bit soft, our policy definitely works and definitely achieves our own goals. I think, and from you want to do the opposite, and you want to immediately be like, this model achieves nothing. So you attack them on their efficacy and prove that nothing actually occurs and no change happens whatsoever. I think at times, sometimes teams go too soft line in their models, because you want to be able to, it's far easier to have some guaranteed success or efficacy of your model. Sorry, laptop running out of power. You want to be able to have some sort of efficacy of your model to then weigh against in later debates. You want to be able to say, yep, there's this harm, but at least our model works. So I think it's always useful to err on the side of having more being harder than being softer. So to look at the examples we've got here, the government should actively disincentivize parents bringing up the children in religious backgrounds. Again, you could ban it, you can make it illegal, or you could just put an education campaign. Once you figure out what your stance in the debate is, you're able to then build a bunch of arguments around what you need to do to prove that. So if you take a very soft line approach, that's just like you send a few letters home, you run a bit of an education campaign, you need to talk about why that is particularly so impactful. Or if you go a bit harder and you like cut off welfare benefits to anyone who raises their child as a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or anything like that, then you really need to be prepared to defend exactly why raising them is so harmful that you're willing to risk a few people not giving their children welfare benefits. And I think the example of Venezuela we've already kind of covered in the debate. So that's particularly important in the debate. I think the way to approach this in a BP sense as well is that if you sense your opening has gone too soft line as OG, at CG you can be like, yep, we're going to accept the O's burden, and I'm going to say even if they're right, we're not going hard enough, we're going to pretend we're going to meet up their own burden, we're going to go harder, and we're going to prove why we're in this debate. So there's space for you to sort of like engage in different areas, obviously without knifing in the debate. So responding, I had a whole slide for this. So If you've got a team that's going hard, attack them with their harms being bad. If they're going soft, attack them with them having no success. So we did kind of cover that already. That I think we've actually now reached the end of the slides. So about 45, 50 minutes was exactly what I was planning to do. So that kind of wraps up where we're at. So let's summarize and the broad takeaways we want to take away from this. Debating is helpful when you know things, and that is an unfortunate reality that it is useful just to have some awareness of what's going on in the world. But even if you don't know exactly what the topic's about, you can sort of approach a topic from a very generic first principles idea and at least intuit and logic out some capacity of something to say based upon a few common ideas that apply to topic areas and often apply across topic areas. So it's good to be across those basics if you've got nothing else to say. And the last thing is that you need to structure your case based exactly around the sort of position you're defending. So think about your case as a whole. If you're going hardline, be ready to defend the harms. If you're going soft line, be ready to defend efficacy and adjust your responsive strategies appropriate to that. And hopefully that will help you address topics you know nothing about. So there's a couple of questions in the chat I want to go back to that I missed earlier, and then I'll get more questions. So there was one here about a motion about 9/11 being George Bush's plan. I was at that tournament as well this weekend. The motion was this House believes George Bush did 9/11. My personal thoughts are that that is not a good motion because it is a question of fact, and there's probably some truth to the motion. I don't think that debate has a closing half, and I'm sorry these aren't particularly useful answers to the person who asked these questions, but I think that is the problem with that debate is it's just not a really good debate. If you did get a debate like that, and it was a BP debate that Bush did 9/11, I think you just got to be looking for gaps in what the other team says. So think of it like a different debate. So should an actor do a bad thing? And in this debate, I guess you would say that George Bush, if he did do 9/11, and to be clear for those watching the live stream in 10 or 15 years' time when I hopefully have a career somewhere, I am not currently advocating the idea that George Bush deliberately did 9/11. It's a theoretical debating exercise. You would think of it like this. George Bush as an actor has done a particularly hardline motion. What does that mean? It means I need to defend the efficacy of my actions. And I need to think about what the interests of the actor were in doing this. So why would George Bush want to do 9/11? Like boost his profile? Well, he did win the next election. Would he want to have a wartime presidency and the benefits that brings? He definitely got a war out of it. So maybe think about it from like his incentives and think about why like the status quo of not having 9/11 was so much worse than having 9/11, which again, I think makes it an impossible AF or an impossible gov. So not a particularly useful answer, I'm sorry, and not a particularly good debate. Sorry to the Agile who said it. All right, I just want to read the next question and I'll get back to answering that as well. All right, so the question we got, the second one is about like, you've got two countries that are separated into country A and country B. And country A is volatile, and lots of people are, so one country is particularly volatile as a consequence. So it's a question about whether or not we should use the hard or the soft method to approach this topic. So I guess they're trying to like fix the volatile conditions in state A after state A and state B have separated to form two different states because of presumably some conflict that led them to separating. I think in that question, it has to be a question of what you think you can most successfully defend as a team. So have a chat to your teammate in that sense and be like, all right, do we think that being hardline and having state B invade state A to try and quell the violence is something that we can defend? If we can prove why that is likely to be successful or why that violence is likely to be so bad, then we'll go with that strategy. If we don't think we can prove that, then we should go a more soft line approach because we can definitely prove some degree of benefit there of like sending aid and that being a benefit. And that's more likely to be successful for us. So it's about what you think you can most easily defend, and it will kind of depend a bit more on the specifics of the motion. If you equally think you can do both, but just have no idea what to do, whether you can equally do them both well or equally do both badly, I think a general rule of thumb is to go a bit more hardline because that does give you capacity to have at least a clearer set of benefits. So if you invade and arrest the president or like arrest the protesters or quell the violence by having military on the streets. That is a benefit you can defend, which is sometimes easier than having a weaker benefit to defend. All right, try and go back to the earlier question. I'll just read it again to myself, and then I'll answer it. So I think this question is about addressing like running arguments that are particularly controversial in one's home country and ones that would be issues of concern to safety. I think this is not particularly a question I can answer in terms of the scope of the presentation. I think if running an argument or running a debate is likely to risk your own personal safety, then you ought prioritize your own safety. As much as debating is fun, it is at the end of the day just a game. And you ought not risk your own safety to run certain arguments. So either don't run those arguments or just try and opt out of the round. And most tournaments should have provisions for speakers to opt out of rounds, specifically in circumstances like this. So definitely always prioritize your own safety. All right, that was all the questions I had in the chat. So if anyone has any further questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll go through them now. Otherwise, thank you all for being a lovely audience tonight. I hope you all learned something. And best of luck for those of you doing Euros next week.
Thank you.
No worries at all. Yeah, I'm not seeing any further questions coming in, so I think people are free to go. There's a few more presentations coming up today, which I'm sure will be excellent as well. So I encourage you guys to hang around for that. And maybe I'll see you guys at Euros next week.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
You mean tomorrow?
Yeah, tomorrow. God, it's so soon.